You don't tell me who you are, boy. I tell you what you are. Those 12 words spoken in a low, almost bored voice by a man with a captain's badge and platinum blonde hair were the last words Captain Dale Rourke would ever utter with any real authority. Though he didn't know that yet, because in the 6 hours that followed that Tuesday evening in the manicured, quiet suburb of Westbrook Hills, 17 police badges would be stripped from their owners forever. A city would be forced to write a $10 million check that would financially cripple it for years. And the man currently being pressed face first into the rough, oil-stained asphalt of Elm Street would walk back through the precinct doors, not as a prisoner, but as the federal officer who had just dismantled an entire corrupt police department with nothing more than patience, a gold shield, and the absolute unshakable certainty that the truth always catches up. But right now, none of that had happened yet. Right now, there was only the cold pavement, the weight of a knee in the center of a man's spine, and the sound of handcuffs ratcheting tight in the amber light of a late afternoon that had, until about 4 minutes ago, been completely ordinary. Westbrook Hills was the kind of place that felt deliberately designed to exclude anyone who hadn't been specifically invited a wealthy insular pocket of the greater metro area where the lawns were cut with geometric precision. The hedgerows stood at identical heights, and the houses behind their white picket fences were large enough to swallow entire apartment buildings. Whole, the kind of neighborhood where a strange car parked for more than 20 minutes on any given block would generate no fewer than 3 separate calls to the non-emergency police line before the hour was out. Robert Dane did not live in Westbrook Hills. At 44 years old, Robert stood 6 feet 2 inches tall with the kind of broad, carefully maintained physical presence that came not from vanity, but from the very practical demands of a career that had on more than a dozen occasions over the past 2 decades required him to physically restrain men who did not want to be restrained. And he was wearing, on this particular Tuesday evening, a faded gray hoodie that had been washed so many times the FBI insignia on the chest had long since disappeared, dark jeans with a small tear above the left knee, and worn-in running shoes that had logged more miles than most people drove in a year. He looked to any casual observer in Westbrook Hills like exactly the kind of person who did not belong there. What no casual observer could have known, however, was that Robert Dane was a supervisory special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, currently 17 months into the final stretch of a 3-year racketeering and financial fraud investigation that had consumed hundreds of thousands of federal hours and the dedicated work of an entire task force, and that the primary target of that investigation, a hedge fund manager named Victor Harlan, whose carefully constructed schemes had defrauded retirement accounts across 4 states, lived behind the wrought iron gate at the end of this very street, in a house large enough to have its own name. Robert's surveillance van was parked 3 blocks north, engine off equipment running on battery logging wire intercepts in real time. He had simply stepped out for 20 minutes to stretch his legs, clear his head, and breathe air that didn't smell like stale coffee and electronics. A small human necessity in the middle of an operation that had kept him sedentary for most of the past 6 hours. And he had been walking in a perfectly straight line along the right-hand side of Elm Street, hands tucked loosely into the front pocket of his hoodie, watching the long shadows the oak trees threw across the pavement when the hairs on the back of his neck stood up with the particular electric certainty that comes from 2 decades of law enforcement instinct being activated all at once. He didn't turn around. He didn't need to. He could hear the low, distinctive roll of a police cruiser's tires tracking his pace from behind the engine, idling just above idle-keeping exact distance, and he knew, with the bone-deep weariness of a man who had navigated this specific dynamic his entire adult life, exactly what was happening and exactly what he needed to do next. He kept his eyes forward, kept his breathing steady, and kept walking. Half a block ahead and slightly to the left on the narrow strip of concrete between the sidewalk and the street, a 9-year-old girl named Maya Webb was sitting cross-legged with a collection of sidewalk chalk arranged by color beside her left knee, carefully adding a yellow sun to the upper corner of a drawing that had, over the course of the afternoon, expanded to cover nearly 6 feet of pavement in every direction. Her father, James Webb, was visible just beyond her, leaning over the open hood of a neighbor's sedan, a socket wrench in one hand and a rag hanging from his back pocket. The kind of quiet, reliable man who had been doing small mechanical favors for the people on this block for the better part of a decade without ever being asked twice. Maya heard the police cruiser before she saw it. She looked up from her drawing chalk still in hand and watched the black and white car moving slowly, far too slowly for normal traffic behind the tall man in the gray hoodie. And something in the picture didn't make sense to her, the way certain things don't make sense to children precisely because they haven't yet learned to explain them away. And she sat very still, watching her yellow chalk, pressing a small, unfinished smear into the pavement as James looked up from the engine, saw what his daughter was watching, set his socket wrench down on the car's bumper without a word, and stepped quietly to stand behind her. The cruiser's siren gave a single short chirp, not a warning, not an emergency, just the particular sound that means "stop and acknowledge me," and the red and blue lights pulsed twice against the white faces of the houses as Officer Dana Holt stepped out of the driver's side door. Dana was 23 years old, 11 months into the job, with her blonde hair pulled back in a tight high ponytail, and she had spent nearly every one of those 11 months absorbing the unspoken but absolutely pervasive culture of the Westbrook Hills Police Department, that this neighborhood belonged to certain people, that certain other people in certain other neighborhoods were threats by default, and that the job of every officer wearing this particular badge was to maintain that boundary with whatever degree of force the situation required, a philosophy that Captain Dale Rourke had been drilling into his officers with the patient, relentless consistency of a man who had never once been told he was wrong. Dana's hand rested on the butt of her service weapon as she closed the distance between herself and Robert, stopping about 10 feet away, and announced that there had been a call about a suspicious individual looking into parked cars along the block. Robert knew immediately and with complete certainty that no such call had been made. He had been walking in a straight line for 4 city blocks without coming within 20 feet of a single parked vehicle. And the pretextual stop was so transparent, so lazily constructed, that under any other circumstances he might almost have felt a flicker of professional irritation at the lack of effort. But instead, he simply turned slowly, both hands coming fully out of his hoodie pocket and opening wide palms visible, and offered in a calm and measured voice to show his identification, which was in his back right pocket. Before Dana could respond, the sound of a heavy engine accelerating hard came around the corner, and a matte black SUV with emergency lights blazing roared into the street, cut across both lanes, and screeched to a halt at a diagonal that blocked the road entirely, and the door opened and Captain Dale Rourke stepped out. There are men in positions of authority who project power through the measured confidence of someone who has genuinely earned it, and then there are men who project power through the systematic grinding elimination of anyone who has ever dared to suggest they might be wrong. And Dale Rourke was unmistakably the second kind. He was 51 years old, with platinum blonde hair cut close in a military style that had softened at the temples to a pale, almost white shade that somehow made him look colder rather than older, and a face that had been flushed a permanent, unhealthy red for so long that the people who worked under him had simply stopped noticing it. A broad, barrel-chested man, whose Westbrook Hills uniform had been custom-tailored to accommodate a physique built less for athletic performance than for physical intimidation, and who had held absolute, largely unquestioned authority over this department for 11 years, through a combination of selective enforcement strategic favors and the very simple, very effective tool of making everyone around him understand quietly and early what happened to people who crossed him. He didn't walk toward Robert. He strode with the particular swagger of a man who had never once in his professional life approached any situation with the assumption that it might not go his way. And he didn't stop at a respectful distance the way departmental procedure required. He came within 18 inches of Robert's face and stood there invading the space deliberately the way a predator tests a boundary to see what gives. His voice when he spoke was not loud. That was the detail Robert registered immediately and filed away with professional precision because Rourke wasn't hissing or barking the way a man driven by temper might. He was speaking in a low, almost conversational tone, the kind of voice that carries the particular chill of someone who is not afraid of consequences because he has spent 11 years engineering a reality in which consequences do not apply to him. Robert understood in that moment with a clarity that settled over him like cold water that reaching for his badge right now in this street with this man with Dana's hand still resting on her weapon carried a physical risk that his federal credentials could not neutralize quickly enough to matter, and that the safer, smarter play was to become for the next several hours exactly what Rourke believed him to be: a civilian with no recourse, no power, and no one coming for him. He would let them take him in. He would get to the station. And then he would dismantle them from the inside. "I am complying," Robert said clearly and without any spike of emotion, turning around and placing both hands flat on the hood of Dana's cruiser exactly as instructed. And Rourke, without warning and without any legitimate reason that the dashcam footage would later be able to support, no matter how creatively the incident report was written, drove his knee sideways into the back of Robert's left leg, hard enough to buckle the joint and send him off balance, and in the split second that Robert staggered, Dana grabbed his left arm and wrenched it behind his back with a force that pushed his shoulder joint to the absolute limit of its range of motion, and Rourke's forearm came down across the back of Robert's neck and drove his face into the hood of the car. "Stop resisting," Rourke announced loudly and clearly, entirely for the dashcam's benefit. Robert had not resisted. Robert had not moved. What happened next was swift and brutal and entirely documentably unprovoked. Rourke swept Robert's legs completely out from under him, and the world tipped sideways, and Robert hit the asphalt with the full, unbroken weight of his body, his cheek scraping across the rough surface and drawing blood immediately, the breath driven from his lungs in a single hard compression, and before he could recover, Rourke's knee dropped like a dropped engine block onto the center of his lower spine, pinning him flat against the road, and the handcuffs came out and were ratcheted onto his wrists so tight that the circulation was cut off within seconds. Robert pressed his cheek against the pavement and did not make a sound. He closed his eyes and began to memorize Dana Holt badge number visible from this angle cruiser designation on the door panel. Time of stop estimated at 6:41 p.m. Rourke's badge number partially visible on his left breast, every word spoken, every action taken, every instruction given and complied with before the force was applied. He was building a federal case, and he was doing it face down on a public street. Maya had not moved. She was still sitting cross-legged on the sidewalk, her yellow chalk abandoned beside her knee, and she was watching the man on the ground with the kind of absolute, unblinking attention that children give to things that their instincts have identified as deeply foundationally wrong. Not crying, not calling out, just watching with wide, dark eyes that took in every detail of the scene with a completeness that would have been remarkable in an adult twice her age. James had both hands on her shoulders from behind, and he said very quietly, "Don't look, baby." But Maya did not look away, and James, after a moment, stopped asking her to. It was Dana who caught it, a peripheral flicker of a 9-year-old girl sitting perfectly still on a chalk-covered sidewalk, watching her with an expression of absolute guileless moral clarity, and something in that image lodged in Dana's chest like a splinter she couldn't locate and couldn't ignore, even as she stepped back from the arrest with a flushed and satisfied expression that her body had assembled automatically, even as some quieter, less practiced part of her understood with a sick and sinking certainty that what had just happened was wrong. The back of the Westbrook Hills cruiser smelled like industrial cleaner and old fear, and it took turns too fast with a cheerful, deliberate carelessness that sent Robert's shoulders slamming into the plexiglass divider every time the vehicle swung around a corner, his cuffed wrists screaming behind his back with every impact. From the front seat, he could hear Rourke and Dana talking in the easy, decompressed tone of two people who had just finished a task that had gone exactly as planned. Rourke calling him a vagrant, announcing he'd charge him with resisting and loitering and maybe assault on an officer if his own knuckles bruised up enough to photograph Dana laughing a little, the adrenaline still audible in her voice. Robert closed his eyes and began the tactical breathing he had learned at Quantico 20 years ago. 4 counts in through the nose. 4 counts held against the cold, tightening in his chest. 4 counts released slowly into the freezing air of the back seat, and as the rhythm of his breathing slowed, his heart rate down with it. He was not thinking about the pain in his wrists, or the blood drying on his cheek, or the grinding humiliation of being transported in the back of a cage like an animal by 2 people who had not earned the right to hold authority over a parking ticket, let alone a federal officer. He was thinking about Monica Reeves 3 miles away in the regional field office, watching a small digital timer on her primary monitor tick past the 60-minute mark with no check-in signal from his device. He was thinking the clock has started. Brooke Callahan was 20 years old, a sophomore studying journalism at the State University, who had been renting the upstairs bedroom of a house on Elm Street for the past 4 months because the rent was manageable and the neighborhood was quiet, and she had been sitting at her desk with a textbook open and a half-eaten sandwich beside her laptop when the sound of the police siren's short, sharp chirp pulled her attention to the window. And what she saw when she looked out kept her at that window completely motionless until the cruiser with Robert inside it disappeared around the corner at the far end of the block. Her phone was already in her hand. She had started recording without making a conscious decision to do it the way the body sometimes acts before the mind has finished deliberating, and she had captured 2 minutes and 47 seconds of unedited, crystal-clear 4K footage that showed with the kind of documentary completeness that no amount of creative report writing could later explain away. A tall man in a gray hoodie complying with every instruction given to him being thrown to the ground by a police captain for no observable reason and saying clearly and without panic in a voice that the microphone on her phone had captured with startling fidelity, "I am a federal agent." Brooke sat on the edge of her bed and played those 4 words back 6 times. She bumped the audio up to maximum, pressed her ear against the speaker, and listened to the particular quality of that voice, not frightened, not performative, not the desperate claim of a man grasping for anything that might make the violence stop, but the flat matter-of-fact statement of a man who was telling a simple truth and expected it to be confirmed by whatever database was accessed afterward, and she felt the understanding settle over her like a change in air pressure. She knew what she had. The question was whether she had the courage to use it. Brooke stood at her window for a long time after the police cars were gone, watching the empty street, and turning the question over in her mind with the methodical anxiety of someone who understood exactly what the answer was going to be and was trying to find a reason to arrive at a different one. Because Dale Rourke was not an abstraction in Westbrook Hills, he was a real and specific kind of power that had, over the past 11 years, made life measurably worse for anyone who attracted his attention. And Brooke was 20 years old and alone in a rented bedroom, and did not have the kind of connections that protect people from that kind of retaliation. Then she looked down. James Webb was walking Maya toward their front door, one large hand resting on his daughter's small shoulder. And Maya, just before the door swung open to receive her, turned and looked back at the stretch of street where the man had been on the ground, with an expression on her face that Brooke would not be able to describe accurately to anyone who asked her later, except to say that it was the face of a child trying to understand why the world had just shown her something that contradicted everything she had been told about how things were supposed to work. That was the moment Brooke stopped deliberating. She created the account in under 3 minutes, anonymous, clean, no identifying information, named it. Westbrook Truth wrote a caption in 2 sentences that named Rourke, described what the video showed, and tagged the FBI's official account. The Department of Justice, the state governor's office, and 3 national news anchors whose names she knew because she had studied their work in her media ethics class. She attached the unedited clip. She pressed post. Her phone began to vibrate 8 minutes later, and it did not stop. The booking room of the Westbrook Hills Police Department was a fluorescent-lit rectangle that smelled like old coffee and floor wax, and the desk sergeant on duty had been working the Tuesday evening shift for so long that virtually nothing that came through the back doors surprised him anymore, until Captain Rourke slapped a thick leather wallet down on the counter in front of him and flipped it open with the casual confidence of a man performing a trick he was certain would land. And the room went silent in a way that was immediately unmistakably different from ordinary silence. The badge that caught the overhead light was not plastic. It was not a prop purchased from an online novelty store. It was a heavy, solid, government-issued gold shield with the weight and specificity of a thing made to last, and beside it protected under a rigid federal housing with a holographic overlay that fractured the fluorescent light into a small constellation of authenticated colors, was an identification card bearing the seal of the United States Department of Justice, a photograph, a barcode, and the name Supervisory Special Agent, Robert Dane, Federal Bureau of Investigation. The desk sergeant stopped chewing. Dana Holt, standing 3 feet to Rourke's left, felt the blood leave her face, so completely and so quickly that she reached out and touched the counter for balance. Robert, standing at the center of all of it, with his hand still cuffed behind his back and dried blood on his left cheek, watched Rourke stare at the credentials with the focused, particular attention of a man whose mind is working very hard to arrive at a conclusion that protects him from the one that is actually correct. And then watched Rourke laugh loudly and with the practiced ease of someone who has spent 11 years never having to genuinely reckon with being wrong and announce that the badge was a fake, a novelty item, a prop, and that he was adding federal impersonation charges to the sheet. Robert lifted his eyes to Rourke's and said with the quiet, absolute certainty of a man who has already decided he will not say this twice, there was a verification number on the back of the credential, a direct line to the DOJ Authentication Center, and if Rourke called that number right now and read them the badge number, this could still end without destroying every single person in this room. Rourke told 2 deputies to take Robert to cell block 4, strip him out, and leave him to think about his choices. The cell was 8 feet by 6 feet, painted the particular shade of institutional green that seems designed specifically to depress the human spirit, lit by a single caged fluorescent bulb that buzzed with an irregular rhythm, and kept at a temperature that the corrections officer who monitored the block had, with the specific creative cruelty of someone who enjoyed small, unaccountable powers, set to 55 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to make the concrete slab that served as a bed feel like a slab of ice through the thin fabric of the white undershirt and shorts that were all Robert had been left with after his hoodie, jeans, and shoes were tagged and bagged. He sat perfectly upright on the concrete with his bare feet flat on the floor, his arms loose at his sides, and he did not pace, did not bang on the door, did not yell for a lawyer or a phone call or a blanket. He breathed. In the cell directly across the narrow corridor, visible through the reinforced glass panels of both doors, a lean man in a grease-stained mechanic's shirt was pressed against his window with the restless, exhausted energy of someone who had been here before, and knew how it ended James Webb, whose car had been seized that morning under a civil forfeiture procedure that required approximately no evidence of wrongdoing, and had left him stranded and his 9-year-old daughter in the care of a neighbor arrested on the basis of a single marijuana cigarette found in his glove compartment during a traffic stop that Rourke's department had been running as a revenue operation for years. The 2 men exchanged a handful of words through the glass, James telling Robert he was going to be here for 72 hours minimum, Robert telling him quietly that he had something better than a lawyer, and then Robert closed his eyes again and returned to the particular discipline of waiting with complete professional patience for something he knew was coming. Supervisory Agent Monica Reeves had been Robert's partner for 9 years before she moved to command, and in those 9 years she had developed an understanding of his operational rhythms that was at this point closer to biological than professional, which was why, at exactly 14 minutes past the hour, with no double-click check-in signal on her secure communications panel, she was already standing up from her desk with the particular focused energy of someone whose body has processed an alarm before the conscious mind has finished articulating it. The GPS tracking on Robert's surveillance van showed it stationary on Elm Street exactly where it was supposed to be. The GPS tracking on Robert's personal device showed it stationary inside the perimeter of the Westbrook Hills Police Department. Monica called the precinct's main line and reached a desk sergeant who put her on hold. She called back, identified herself as a supervisory special agent of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and the line went dead. She stood in the middle of the field office bullpen and looked at the large digital map on the wall at the blinking green dot that represented a senior federal agent who had been taken into custody by a local police department that had just hung up on the FBI. And when she turned to her tactical lieutenant, her voice had dropped into a register that everyone in the bullpen recognized immediately as the one that meant the conversation was over and the next phase had begun. "They took him," she said. "Get me the SAC, the U.S. Attorney, and the hostage rescue team. We are going to Westbrook Hills. If you think the next 6 hours sound like justice, stay right here, because what happens when the full weight of the federal government arrives at that precinct door is something you are not going to want to miss. And if you haven't subscribed to our channel yet, now is exactly the right time." The secure satellite line connected Hannah Voss at 11 minutes past 8 on a Tuesday evening, pulling her out of a deep sleep with the particular trained efficiency of someone who had learned long ago that calls on this line did not wait for convenient hours. And by the time Monica had delivered the 90-second summary in the clipped, precise language of a federal briefing, Hannah was already sitting upright in bed with the full, cold alertness of a woman who had built her career on prosecuting people who believed their authority exempted them from accountability. Hannah Voss was the United States Attorney for the district, a prosecutor whose conviction rate across 2 decades had made her name into a kind of shorthand in federal law enforcement circles for the particular brand of relentless, methodically documented destruction that she brought to every case she touched. And she listened to Monica's briefing without interrupting once. And when Monica finished, the silence on the line lasted exactly 3 seconds before Hannah asked a single clarifying question about the status of the tactical team, and then issued the declaration that set everything that followed into motion. This was a federal hostage situation. Monica was authorized to breach. Every person in that building wearing a badge was to be placed under federal arrest by dawn. 3 hostage rescue team units were already staged 2 miles out from the precinct when Monica's convoy of armored federal vehicles came off the interstate and the helicopter, a matte black UH-60 that had been running dark at altitude for 23 minutes, received its clearance to descend as Monica's lead vehicle turned onto the final approach road to Westbrook Hills. At the moment, Monica's convoy was staging 2 miles from the precinct. The clip that Brooke Callahan had posted from her upstairs bedroom on Elm Street had been alive on the internet for 41 minutes, long enough for a civil rights attorney in New York City with a significant following to stumble across the tagged post watch, the 2 minutes and 47 seconds of footage in full, and repost it with a comment that used the specific legal language of unlawful detention under color of law, which was the kind of language that traveled fast in certain networks and lit up the algorithm in a way that pure outrage alone almost never managed to achieve. The clip crossed 100,000 views at the 30-minute mark. It crossed 1 million at 52 minutes. By the time the first Bearcat crested the hill above Westbrook Hills, the video had been picked up by 3 national cable networks. The Associated Press had published an initial news alert, and the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division had opened a formal preliminary inquiry, all of which was happening in a world that Captain Dale Rourke had no access to from behind the walls of his own precinct, where he was sitting at his mahogany desk with his boots up, writing a police report about a John Doe vagrant with a fake federal badge, completely unaware that the digital architecture of his professional destruction was being assembled in real time by millions of people who had watched a 9-second clip of his knee dropping onto an unarmed man's spine and made their judgment in approximately that amount of time. Brooke was sitting on her bedroom floor with her back against the bed, watching the view counter move like a slot machine, paying out her phone so hot from continuous notification vibration that she had set it on the carpet in front of her because she couldn't hold it comfortably anymore. The first thing the residents of Westbrook Hills heard was a sound that didn't belong, a deep, rhythmic thrumming that seemed to come from everywhere at once and grew in intensity faster than made sense until it had moved from background noise to something felt in the chest before it was fully processed by the ears, and then the sky above the municipal center went white. The UH-60 Blackhawk descended to 200 feet directly above the Westbrook Hills Police Department, its search beam painting the entire front facade of the building in a harsh, inescapable light that turned the decorative American flags along the entrance into whipping, frantic shapes, and the rotor wash sent loose gravel from the parking lot, skittering across the pavement in all directions like a small, violent storm. On the ground, 3 Lenco Bearcat tactical vehicles in flat FBI blue came around the corner of the main road at speed, and the lead vehicle didn't use the driveway. It mounted. The curb tore 2 deep trenches through the carefully maintained front lawn of the police department and came to a stop with its reinforced front bumper 8 inches from the glass doors of the lobby, and the other 2 fanned wide to seal the building's front and rear exits against any possibility of escape. Inside the precinct, the atmosphere of comfortable, predictable authority evaporated in approximately the time it took Dana Holt to look up from the filing cabinet where she had been sitting and register what was happening outside the reinforced front windows. A bottle of nail polish slipping from her fingers and shattering on the linoleum in a slow, spreading stain, and the lobby doors blew off their frames with a concussive report that cracked every pane of glass within 30 feet. And 20 federal operators in Level 4 tactical gear came through the smoke and the settling drywall dust with the fluid, terrifying precision of people who train for this specific moment with a seriousness that the Westbrook Hills Police Department had never once been required to match. Red laser sights swept the room. The desk sergeant threw his hands up before anyone spoke to him, dropping straight to his knees so fast he bruised them both on the tile floor, and Dana's hand moved toward her holster on pure, trained instinct before a federal operator closed the distance in 3 strides and placed the barrel of an M4 carbine at a precise and non-negotiable angle that stopped her hand completely and replaced every thought in her head with the single overwhelming understanding that she was not in this moment a police officer. She was a suspect. She started crying before her hands were behind her back. Dale Rourke had his office door open by the time the first operator reached the hallway, drawn by the explosion and the shouting and the vibration that had rattled his coffee mug off the edge of his desk. And he stood in the doorway and looked at what his lobby had become, and the part of his brain that had been running on 11 years of absolute unquestioned local authority experienced something very close to a complete systems failure. His hand moved toward his duty weapon. "Go ahead." The voice was female calm and carried through the chaos of the lobby with the particular carrying quality of someone who has spent a career making herself heard in rooms full of noise, and the tactical operators parted to allow Monica Reeves to walk through the shattered entrance with her badge on her belt, and her hand resting loosely on the grip of her sidearm, and an expression on her face that was not anger. It was colder than anger, and far more specific. 12 red laser dots appeared on Rourke's chest, his throat, his forehead. The hand that had been moving toward his weapon stopped. It kept moving away from the weapon and upward. And Dale Rourke, the man who had told a federal officer lying face down on his street that he would decide what that man was, went to his knees on the floor of his own precinct, with the particular devastating completeness of someone who has just understood all at once and without any remaining room for negotiation exactly how wrong he has been. The hallway of cell block 4 was narrow and cold and painted the same dispiriting green as the cell itself, and Monica walked it fast with 2 operators flanking her, their flashlight beams cutting ahead of her through the dark, and she jammed the large brass key into the lock of cell block 4 with a force that was not strictly necessary, but felt in the moment completely appropriate, and the door groaned open on its hinges and released a gust of 55-degree air that hit her face like a wall. "Robert." "I'm here, Monica." The voice came from the first cell on the left, calm, deep, entirely recognizable, carrying none of the fragmentation that extreme cold and physical trauma typically introduce into human speech, which told her before she even reached the door more about his condition than any visual assessment would have. She looked through the reinforced glass. He was sitting perfectly upright on the concrete slab with his bare feet flat on the floor and his arms folded loosely around his torso, wearing nothing but a white undershirt and shorts, shivering in the controlled, contained way of someone who is managing a physical experience, rather than being overwhelmed by it. And there was a bruise spreading across his left cheek and dried blood in a line from his cheekbone to his jaw, and the skin around his wrists was raw and weeping where the metal cuffs had been applied far tighter than any legitimate restraint procedure required. But his eyes, when they met hers through the glass, were the eyes of someone who had been waiting, not suffering, and the distinction was everything. She got the door open, the door. She stripped off her FBI raid jacket and wrapped it around his shoulders without being asked, and she squeezed his shoulder with the grip of someone who is not going to let the professional context of the moment prevent her from communicating the one thing that actually matters, and she asked him if he was okay. "I made you miss dinner," he said. "You missed check-in by 14 minutes, she said. "I nearly took the building apart." She reached into her jacket pocket and produced his leather wallet, opened it to the gold shield, the one Rourke had laughed at, and held it out to him. Robert took it in both hands, his fingers still numb from the cold, and traced the seal with his thumb, and something shifted in the compressed air of that frozen cell, some transfer of weight from one configuration to another, as the man who had spent the past several hours choosing to be invisible reclaimed in the simplest possible gesture exactly who he was. Before they left, he stopped at the cell across the corridor and looked at James Webb, who was staring at him through the glass with the wide, disbelieving expression of a man watching something happen that he will spend years trying to describe accurately to people who weren't there. And Robert told Monica to add James Webb's name and case to the civil forfeiture review, and Monica said done without looking at her notepad, and the look on James Webb's face was something that would take him a long time to find words for. He walked back into the main bullpen 3 minutes later wearing his gray hoodie and his worn-in jeans and his old running shoes with his federal badge clipped to the outside of his hoodie, where every person in the room could see it without having to look twice. And the silence in the room, which had already been significant, deepened into something that felt less like quiet and more like the absence of all the noise those 17 people had been making with their authority for the past 11 years, now that the authority was gone. 17 Westbrook Hills police officers were kneeling along the bullpen wall with federal zip ties on their wrists, facing the scratched paint and the old departmental notices pinned to the corkboard, and they turned their heads as Robert walked in, and Dana Holt, when she recognized the man whose arm she had wrenched behind his back 4 hours ago, pressed her face into her knees and made a sound that was not quite a sob. Robert stopped in the center of the room. At his feet, on his knees, in the full uniform that was now stripped of its badge, its weapon, its radio, and every other external signifier of the power he had constructed over 11 years, was Dale Rourke, and Rourke looked up because he couldn't not look up, and the expression on his face in that moment was not defiance or bluster, or the desperate scramble for a rationalizing narrative that his mind had been running since the breach, but simply the hollow, inescapable recognition of a man who has run out of room. Robert looked at him for a long moment without speaking. Then he said, very quietly, "I told you to make the call." Rourke opened his mouth. Nothing came out. "You didn't listen." Robert continued his voice, carrying the particular devastating authority of someone who doesn't need volume to fill a room. "So now I'm going to do my job. He crouched beside Rourke, took the federal handcuffs from the operator standing nearest and locked them onto Rourke's wrists, and read him his Miranda rights in the same steady, even voice he had used on every arrest in 20 years of federal service, without a single modification to reflect the personal nature of this particular moment. Because the law did not require one, and Robert Dane had not spent 2 decades building a career on the law in order to treat it differently when it finally served him directly. Mayor Gerald Ashton and Chief of Police Thomas Harwell arrived at 20 minutes past 9 in a black Lincoln that stopped on the ruined front lawn of the precinct with a kind of stunned, jolting urgency. Both men tumbling out in expensive suits thrown over pajama bottoms, their faces arranged in the particular expression of officials who have arrived at a situation they believed they were coming to control and have just realized with stomach-dropping completeness that it is approximately 100% already outside their jurisdiction. Ashton demanded explanations. Harwell demanded identification. Monica gave them the tablet. The clip was playing on loop the one shot by Brooke Callahan from an upstairs bedroom on Elm Street in crystal clear 4K 2 minutes and 47 seconds of evidence that no incident report in any filing cabinet in this building could contextualize into something that didn't look exactly like what it was. And beneath the clip, the view counter read 2.7 million, and the breaking news chyron from CNN was visible in the frame that Monica had screenshot and set as the screen's default display. Ashton watched 30 seconds of it and went the color of old chalk. Robert told them without raising his voice. What was going to happen? The FBI was seizing the building. The servers all dashcam footage and all personnel records, and a federal lawsuit against the city was already drafted, and the choice in front of them was whether they wanted to fight it and give the Department of Justice the opportunity to excavate every other thing this department and this administration had buried over the past 11 years, or whether they wanted to sign a federal consent decree tonight and let the Bureau do what needed to be done. Ashton looked at Rourke in handcuffs. He looked at the cameras outside the shattered entrance. He said, "Where do I sign?" The room had cleared considerably by the time Robert walked past the bench where Dana Holt was sitting. Her hands still zip-tied behind her, her face blotched and wet, her eyes fixed on the floor with the particular defeated exhaustion of someone who has just watched every version of her future that she had imagined rearrange itself into something unrecognizable. Robert slowed. He stopped. He stood in front of her for a moment, and Dana looked up, and for the first time since she had gotten out of that cruiser on Elm Street, she was looking at Robert Dane without any of the perceptual filters that her training and her culture and her captain's influence had been layering between her vision and the reality of other people for the past 11 months. And what she saw was not a threat, not a suspect, not a category, just a man with a bruised cheek and raw wrists who was looking back at her with an expression she could not read because she had never seen it before. It was not forgiveness. It was not contempt. It was the look of someone who understands that a person can be both genuinely wrong and genuinely capable of becoming something different, and who has chosen to let that remain a possibility without pretending it resolves anything. "I know it doesn't mean much," Dana said, her voice rough and small. "But I'm sorry." Robert held her gaze for one more second. Then he walked on. That single second, the acknowledgement without absolution, the recognition without release would sit in Dana Holt's chest for every one of the long months ahead, and it would be the thing she reached for when she was deciding over and over again, in the years that followed, what kind of person she was going to build from the wreckage of who she had been. Dawn arrived in Westbrook Hills with the particular surreal quality of a morning that has been preceded by a night that the neighborhood was not built to contain. The television news vans were already 3 deep along the perimeter tape that the FBI had strung from the property line of the precinct to the far end of the parking lot, their satellite dishes raised and their cameras aimed at the loading bay doors with the focused patience of people who know exactly what they're waiting for. And the crowd that had gathered on the public sidewalk beyond the tape was composed of Westbrook Hills residents, who had many of them spent years careful not to know too much about the man who ran their police department, and were now standing in the early morning cold in coats thrown over nightclothes watching. The loading bay doors rolled up at 6:47 a.m. They came out in a single-file line, 17 of them in the orange of federal custody, rather than the navy of the department they would never wear again. Wrists chained, ankles chained, eyes finding the ground in the practiced, instinctive way of people who understand that the cameras are going to see everything and have made the calculation that the pavement is better than the faces of their neighbors. Dana Holt came out near the middle of the line, her chin down, her blonde hair loose around her face. Dale Rourke came out last in the leather restraint belt reserved for high-risk federal transfers, and the crowd that had been watching in near silence for the preceding minutes found its voice as he appeared, not uniformly, not orchestrated. Just the organic sound of people who had been quiet about something for a very long time, finally deciding they were finished being quiet. Robert stood in the shattered lobby doorway and watched the line move past the cameras and into the waiting federal transport vehicles, and he did not add his voice to the crowds, and he did not smile, because none of what he was watching was a victory that deserved celebration. It was simply the outcome that had always been mathematically guaranteed from the moment Rourke had decided on a quiet street in the amber light of a Tuesday evening that he was above the law that Robert Dane had spent 20 years serving. The morning was still cool and pale when James Webb walked out of the Westbrook Hills Federal Processing Center with his car keys in his hand and his daughter beside him, Maya, who had spent the night with a neighbor and had arrived at the processing center that morning in the same clothes she'd been wearing the day before, with a small smear of yellow chalk still on her left knee that nobody had noticed until now. They walked together along the edge of the block, past the stretch of Elm Street, where the chalk drawing was still visible on the pavement, faded at the edges from the foot traffic of the past 18 hours, but still there, the yellow sun in the corner still recognizable, and when they passed the front of the Westbrook Hills Police Department with its FBI crime scene tape and its shattered entrance and the lawn gouged into muddy furrows. By the Bearcats' approach, Maya slowed. She looked at the building for a moment. Then she looked up at her father. "Is the man okay?" she asked. "The man from yesterday?" James looked down at her, then out at the taped perimeter, then back. "He's okay, baby. He's more than okay." And the ones who heard him, James, was quiet for a moment. "They're not okay," he said, finally, simply. "Not anymore." Maya considered this with the focused, serious attention she gave to things that seemed important. And then she nodded once and took her father's hand, and they kept walking, and behind them on the sidewalk, the chalk sun in the corner of her drawing caught the morning light soft and yellow, and still there. 9 months later, in a federal courtroom that had been filled to its public gallery capacity, every day of the trial, Dale Rourke sat at the defense table in a gray suit that no longer fit him. The way his uniform had diminished, somehow compressed the physical confidence of 11 years of unaccountable power having drained out of him in the months of pretrial detention and replaced with something quieter and much more accurately sized. And when the jury foreman stood to deliver the verdict after 40 minutes of deliberation, the word guilty landed in the room 17 consecutive times once for each federal count, with the particular cumulative weight of things that have been building for a very long time, finally coming to rest. The judge, a 63-year-old woman named Judge Patricia Wren, who had been on the federal bench for 22 years and had 0 recorded instances of being moved by theatrics of any kind, looked at Rourke over her reading glasses with the unhurried, uncomplicated directness of someone who had already decided what needed to be said and was simply waiting for the appropriate procedural moment to say it, and delivered a sentence of 120 months in a maximum security federal facility with no eligibility for early release and the complete and permanent revocation of his police pension. The gavel came down. Rourke's knees buckled. The marshals on either side of him caught him under the arms, which was a mercy he had not extended to Robert Dane on the pavement of Elm Street, and they walked him backward toward the holding door. And as they did, his eyes found the gallery. Found Robert sitting in the front row in a charcoal suit with his badge on his belt, watching with the same steady, impersonal calm he had worn face down on the asphalt 9 months before, and there was nothing in Robert's expression for Rourke to hold on to. No anger that might have felt familiar and therefore survivable, just the quiet, settled, irrevocable fact of consequence. The door closed. The city of Westbrook Hills settled the federal civil rights lawsuit for $10 million, a payment that required the city council to raise property taxes across every residential bracket in the district, meaning that the people whose quiet, manicured lives had been maintained and protected by Rourke's department for 11 years were now directly and financially paying the cost of what that protection had actually been, and the Westbrook Hills Police Department was dissolved and replaced by a federally supervised public safety office operating under a consent agreement with new training requirements, new oversight structures, and a mandate to rebuild from the ground up. Robert Dane donated every dollar of his personal settlement to a national legal defense fund for people facing wrongful arrest and civil asset forfeiture who couldn't afford to fight back on their own. Dana Holt served 22 months of a 2-year federal sentence, lost her certification permanently, and came out the other side of it with the deliberate, slightly raw quality of someone who has had every comfortable self-deception taken from them and has chosen to treat that as information rather than injury. And she began working with a nonprofit that provided training consultation to police reform initiatives, not because it absolved her of anything, but because it was the only direction that felt honest, and honest was the one thing she had left to offer. Westbrook Hills looked different in the spring, not different the way a renovation looks different. All fresh surfaces and deliberate newness, but different the way a place looks when something that had been pressing down on it for a long time has been removed, and the things that were always growing underneath have finally had the space to become visible. People who had lived on the same blocks for years and never spoken to each other started speaking not about Rourke, not about the trial, not about the $10 million or the consent decree, but about ordinary things. The small, navigable currency of neighbors who have decided to stop maintaining careful distance from one another. And there was something in the texture of those conversations that hadn't been there before, a kind of permission that had needed to be created before anyone could use it. Brooke Callahan was invited to address the city council at their first public meeting under the new oversight structure, and she accepted, and she said only one thing before sitting down: "I just did what anyone in my position should have done." The harder question isn't why I posted the video, it's why it took a video for anyone to listen. On the morning after the verdict, Robert and Monica walked down the courthouse steps together into the first genuinely warm day of the year, the kind of morning that feels like a specific offered thing rather than just weather. And Monica asked him if he thought Rourke would make it through 10 years. Robert considered the city block stretching out before him, the ordinary movement of ordinary people in an ordinary morning, and said, "That's up to him. The world is a little safer today. That's what matters." Monica looked at him sideways. "So what's next?" He looked up at the sky for a moment, then back down the street, and a small, unhurried smile moved across his face for the first time in a long time. "It's a nice morning," he said. "I think I'll take a walk." Maya was 10 years old by the time her class was asked on an ordinary Tuesday what they wanted to be when they grew up. And while the answers came flying in from all directions, loud and happy and wonderfully certain, Maya sat with the question for a moment longer than the others before she raised her hand and said that she wanted to be the kind of person who, when something is wrong, doesn't look away. Her teacher asked what she meant. Maya thought about a chalk drawing on a sidewalk and a man on the ground who had stayed calm and a door closing on something that deserved to be closed. "I already know what it looks like," she said. "I just need to grow into it."